So I'm going to remind you, I told you about it during the China tour, but a little reminder never hurts. So it's always the rising power, revanchist imperialist. The rising power plays its part on its side, being relatively allied with the revanchist imperialist, but above all allied in the conduct of military operations. There was never any coordination between the United States and Napoleonic France. There was none between Japan and Germany. In fact, practically none at all, and each played its own part, and so it would probably be the same between China and Russia. But the rising powers action is opportunistic. In other words, it takes advantage of the fact that the thalassocracy is very busy with the vengeful imperialist, so that it in turn can play the next move. So, next card, I'll call you back. I showed the map at the time of the China program, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Just a little projection to say, as we've just seen, what would be the maximum extension of Russian hegemony during the conflict. What would be the maximum extension of Chinese hegemony? So you have a large number of countries that are already more or less allies of China. Japan is perhaps a maximum hypothesis. The invasion of Japan by China is complicated. South Korea already seems more likely. That's a hypothesis. Always the same. We're in the range. We're on the high end for Japan, probably on the high end for northern India, but for everything else, yeah, perhaps a high range for Vietnam, which might be more resilient, but for Myanmar, for example, well, with the coup d'etat, we can feel which way they're going to lean. North Korea is already under Chinese influence. South Korea could probably be taken relatively easily. Taiwan would probably be attacked. The Philippines are already in an ambiguous situation and could tip over to the Chinese side if they really feel the balance of power shifting. Sri Lanka is already a very important Chinese partner. Bangladesh too, etc. And Northeast India is already under Chinese influence. And Northeast India, the part separated by the famous chicken coup from the rest of Indian territory, would be relatively easy to invade too. So this is the hypothesis of the projection, what the projection could be at Chinese level. And it's likely that the main part of the Chinese movement, so it would have started the war, as I mentioned earlier, around Kashmir before. That's surely going to be the first stage. On the other hand, the rest, if there's a further advance, in particular towards Taiwan, that will probably happen around the time when things start to go wrong in Europe, as I've just said, if NATO has a major setback against Russia in Europe. At that point, China will say, well, it's open bar for Taiwan, the US is finished, Biden is finished. It could still be Biden at that point, so Taiwan to us, that's what it would look like from that point of view. Then you have the projection of China at the end of the war. But I'll come back to that later. So we can display the following map. This is the other important thing, is that all revanchist imperialists always have a country that's a bit of a sidekick that fights alongside them, but is a second-rate power compared to them, and which often suffers a great deal in its military activity, is in great difficulty, and which in the end the revanchist imperialist is obliged to invade himself in order to keep afloat. This was the case with Spain, which was allied with Napoleon's France and which ended up being invaded outright. It was the case with Italy for Germany, and I would remind you that the Republic of Bastardy, which is not an insult, is the name of a town that was established in northern Italy after the invasion. The Allied landings in Sicily and then in southern Italy was invaded by the Germans to be defended because the Italians couldn't move, and the equivalent, I think, still in the sense of this displacement is probably Iran. During the War of the Oranges, Spain opposed Portugal, resulting in unfavorable outcomes for Spain due to the support that Portugal received from Great Britain. Alongside this ongoing conflict, Italy made efforts to invade Albania and Greece, with the exception of Yugoslavia, as they believed Greece held immense strategic value. However, Mussolini's attempt to invade Greece ultimately proved unsuccessful. So, go on. The next image. Next. No, give me... Yeah, Italy, Mussolini. That's it. Italy, Mussolini. That's it. So, already very elegant. Mussolini had scratched out a piece of territory for us, France, after we'd been defeated by Germany. And then, so, invasion of Albania and invasion of Greece. It went badly, but in the end, they were helped by the Germans. So, they managed to... It goes wrong. Sorry. That goes wrong. That's it. Italy couldn't have attacked Greece. That's the important thing. Italy couldn't have done it, couldn't have attacked Greece, which was a British ally if Great Britain hadn't already been under the German Blitz in a deplorable strategic position, on the verge of surrendering, or at any rate of signing peace with Hitler by negotiating. Can you remove the other card at the back? So back when the world's policeman was still good, Italy wouldn't have allowed itself. But as soon as the world's policeman started to get busy, as I was saying, it allowed a whole host of secondary players to say to themselves, ah, well, now that's it, I can play my part and get on with it. So that's what Italy did at the time, and it's probably what Iran will want to do too, taking advantage of the weakening and occupation. If they see the Americans busy against Russia, and maybe even against China at the same time, Iran will say to itself, it's open bar. So look at me. You're putting me in Middle Eastern secondary theater, please. There you go. You can put Italy Mussolini back on the top, because at the top you have the map. The map at the top, it shows you the Shiite world, where the population is predominantly Shiite, and where the gas and oil are. Very important, because in fact the regions in the area where the gas and oil are essentially Shiite regions. Shiite. Today in Saudi Arabia, as you can see, most of the Sunni population lives on the coast of the Red Sea. That's where you have Amik, that's where you have Medine, that's where you look further inland, but it's really in the Sunni area, whereas most of the oil is exploited in Shiite territory. So presumably, what Iran wants to do, probably with Russia's blessing, is part of a global geostrategic confrontation, is to take control. It's already been supporting the Houthi rebellion in Yemen for years, of the whole Shiite area in the region, using its weapons and backed by Russia, and then that's what would happen. In any case, that would be Iran's ambition. It's quite possible that things could go wrong there too, in the same way as they went wrong for Syria, for Mussolini's Italy, and that it's only thanks to Russia's help that things are moving. In any case, this is to show you the kind of secondary theater where things could get busy and go wrong. Next step, Turkey. As I said, Turkey's position towards Russia is very much a German-Soviet pact, but one day it's going to snap, and in particular because historically speaking, Turkey and Russia are major enemies. For centuries they've been at each other's throats. Crimea was taken from the Turks. Armenia and Azerbaijan, which was part of the USSR, were all conquered from the Turks by Russia. They really are hereditary enemies. On top of that, they're ideological enemies, with Putin, who likes to play the card of defending the Christians of the East, the Orthodox world, and so on. Erdogan's Turkey, on the other hand, is Islamist, and I refer you to the program I did on this subject. So what's more, there will come a time when Russia will no longer have much patience and will no longer feel it needs Turkey's friendship, because in fact, what's very important is that Turkey is the southern pillar of NATO, facing up to Russia. It was a strategic defeat for Russia, for NATO, and the United States in particular, to see Turkey gradually get into bed with Putin and get along with him. Because it means that in the south, we no longer have this very important ally, which was very important during the Cold War, because it's a large army, which is still relatively well equipped, and above all it's numerous, so it's a fairly strong threat in the south. If Turkey is neutralized within NATO, that also leaves room for Putin, who favors what I was saying earlier, the Ukraine and all that. It's also possible because of this, and it's also because having Turkey in NATO also allows NATO to be paralyzed. In other words, if a conference is organized to decide whether, under Article 5, to go to the aid of the Baltic states, Erdogan will say what? He's unlikely to side with the West and say, right, let's wage war on Putin. He's going to paralyze the thing, he's going to play Putin's card, and at the same time Putin will concede him advantages. But from the moment Putin's Russia really has a strategic ascendancy, just as it did for Hitler's Germany, at that point there's no peace. And just as was the case at the time after the Treaty of Tilsit between Napoleon and the Emperor Alexander, there was a phase of peace and even alliance with Russia, even though it was an enemy with a strategic basis between France and Russia. Then came the idea of the continental blockade, and it was because Russia didn't respect the continental blockade that Napoleon decided to invade. And also because, since he dominated the whole of Europe anyway, he felt invincible. He set off to conquer Russia with an army of 600,000 men, 650,000 men, probably the largest army the world had ever seen. As you know, things went badly wrong there too, but when Napoleon set out, it was because he felt truly invincible. And he didn't need to, he wanted to impose himself directly. So presumably, once we get to that point, mechanically, you've got a war against Turkey, probably to reduce it definitively, which would intervene. Especially as there's every reason for things to get out of hand. Armenia, Syria, Greece, everywhere. They're not on the same side. And so it would be Russia's Barbarossa plan. So there's less space to conquer easily before dying. So unlike Napoleon and Hitler, they're not going to go all the way to Moscow. The terrain is completely different. To invade Turkey, you either have to cross seas or you have to cross mountains. So it would probably be quite a difficult war, all the more so as Turkey would automatically fall back into the NATO camp and be backed by the Americans very strongly, as was the USSR, and that's why in the end Turkey will be on the winning side, as I explained to you. But I only mentioned it because I hadn't done the show about the war. I'll explain why Turkey will be on the winning side, and why it will then be able to expand and impose itself on the whole Turkish world, creating the pan-Turkish empire we'll see later. What is the following map? This is it. In this idea, the territories controlled at their apogee in a relatively advanced but not maximalist range. Here's what it would look like, quite simply, between what China and Russia are doing. So you can see that their entire Asia would be controlled. Next map. I'll simply show you two maps. At the top you have the truly maximum map, where Iran would succeed in its move, Russia would be on its maximum estimate, and China on its maximum expansion. It's possible, as I said, that we'll remain in a Cold War with small proxy wars. That's not what I'm mainly dealing with today, because in fact there's less need for me to explain in that case. A Cold War, as you can see. Borders don't move. There are little proxy wars going on left and right around Taiwan, around Kashmir, around the Baltic states, or in the Ukraine, you name it. So I won't go into detail, but this would really be the minimal camp, i.e. a Cold War or one with very little heat. Just these little proxy wars that I've shown you with little explosions to illustrate, but at that point there would be no extension beyond the territory. That's assuming there's no war of movement, so it's really minimal. And then the upper range is the large territory. So what we have to tell you is that the reality will be somewhere in between, and it may be at one of the two levels. That's the historionomic range. We won't be at minus, i.e. there won't be any conflict between China and Russia at all. Things will settle down and so on. No, we're heading for a confrontation. And we won't be at more, i.e. you won't have Russia and China invading the whole of Africa, the whole of Australia, and reaching all the way to America either. Is that all right? And that's it. What are the two estimates? Well, what's very interesting is that there will probably be a lot of technological developments, and we'll probably be heading for war. Wars always last about the same length of time. Once again, it's a question of order of magnitude. For example, the Napoleonic War lasted 12 years, or 7 or 8. It all depends on the abdication date you take and the start date, but, well, let's admit from the war of the war at the time, we're more on 8-9 years. If you take the Second World War, you're looking at 39, 45, 5, 6 years. So we're on a ratio of 1 to 2, but we're on the same order of magnitude. For example, historians often say that if the Allies had never managed to break Enigma, the war would have lasted 2 or 3 years longer. Well, in which case we'd have been on roughly the same timeline as Napoleon's empire. So we're in that order. So in all likelihood, this set of confrontations would last between, 4 and 10 years. Or 4 to 8 years, let's say. So that's plenty of time for industry to make great strides, since budgets are exploding at that point. A whole host of technologies that had been dormant or were being worked on a little are developed industrially and in series. So there you have the suit. I can't remember what it's called, but it's a military exoskeleton with armor, etc., that can withstand 0.50 caliber. Russian suit. It's called, I can't remember what it's called, so it's a Russian name. What does it stand for, 0.50? So I'm not a military experimentalist. I think it must be Kalashnikov caliber or something. You can check, but I think it's the standard caliber of military weapon, machine gun. Basically, the guy can run and get shot with the weapon that normally kills soldiers, but it basically bounces off him. The guy's a space marine, so that's it. The Americans, they have similar things. Again, I'm telling you, we wouldn't be on masses of millions of men fighting. That's probably the end of it. I explained to you when I did the history of civilizations, Europe, Greece, that there comes a time when you're dealing with masses of men, but that military history corresponds to socio-economic history, and that it therefore evolves. We're no longer in a phase where we're fighting with fewer men, but who are much better equipped. And the apogee of the thing is when we find ourselves in a kind of Middle Ages where there are very, very few armies, but the guy who's equipped, he needs something that costs, it takes 10 villages to pay for his equipment. We're still in the era of big state warfare, so you can have 30,000 men equipped with this, but you can't equip 2 million men with equipment like this, in all likelihood. And anyway, there's no point in equipping 2 million advancing kikis with nuclear air power, but in any case, we'd have an evolution that would go like that. So all the stealth tank modes we're seeing, all that sort of thing, I haven't given you a collection of images, you'll have to look for them. However, there is a high probability that all these items will be utilized, including the deployment of large numbers of drones, as we have witnessed in traditional warfare, specifically in the ongoing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Lately, therefore, drones are no longer used solely for one-off operations against terrorists and surgical operations, but strategies and tactics are being put in place to use them on a massive scale in confrontations against regular armies. So that too, so drones, that sort of thing, probably electric cannons, etc., all these things. It's not great military art, but it's just to give you a rough idea of the movements that would constitute reconquest in this context. We can imagine then that things will evolve to such an extent that systems will be put in place that are truly anti-missile, and that the war to come will also be the war of the end of nuclear weapons. It's possible. So maybe nuclear weapons will be used, for example, and China and Russia will be vitrified. It's possible, and we can't rule it out, that there could be a nuclear war like that. But it's also possible that for other reasons, due to the development of other technologies such as anti-missile lasers, the Americans are already developing these. Let's imagine that in the space of a few years, after all, the Manhattan Project was an equivalent technological mode, we could develop extremely powerful anti-missile shields, making nuclear weapons obsolete in their current form, which is often the case with wars. The First World War ended with aviation and tanks, whereas it had begun like the wars of the 19th century, with masses of men with rifles, essentially. So it's not out of the question. And at that point, what order of troop progression would there be? In particular, the main support point in Europe for the reconquest would be, I think, Turkey. Again, it's not impossible that we in France remain neutral. Maybe not, but maybe yes. I couldn't say. But in all likelihood, Turkey, which would probably be attacked, notably because it's non-nuclear, as I was saying earlier, would probably be the one to use, because in addition we're making people fight, we want to save men. So in all likelihood it would be flooded with equipment and weapons, and could therefore invade the entire space that would be that of the future pan-Turkish Empire, in the same way as I explained in the program on Turkey, that Prussia had benefited from the end of the war, to gradually re-establish its hegemony over Germany. And above all from the way in which the USSR had truly become a kind of pan-Slavic empire, reaching right to the heart of Europe, thanks to the Warsaw Pact, i.e., the countries that had been invaded by Russian troops repelling the Germans. That's what would happen. The next world would emerge from these movements. Just to give you a rough idea, what's the endgame? What does it look like? You have the maximum expansion of the Ester-Vanchard Empire. Black is its borders at the start of the war, and in yellow, its borders at the end. So you have the borders of Napoleonic France, which extend into Italy, which extend to the left bank of the Rhine, the expansion of the Napoleonic Empire, and then the way in which France is reduced to its original territory after defeat. The same goes for Germany, with its territory shrinking at the end. And so what would that look like for Russia? Really, that is to say, a Russia that would be reduced to the Urals. and that the victors would deprive by cutting it up. That is precisely the fate that befell Macedonia because of the Romans, and Germany faced a similar destiny. Throughout history, the conquering powers have always sought to strip the defeated nation of its crucial strategic resources, particularly the abundant reserves of gas, oil, and other supplies it possesses. Therefore, it is my belief that in the event of a defeat, Russia would also suffer this same fate and essentially transform into a new West Germany, primarily focusing on economic development while being disarmed, a consequence that typically befalls imperialist powers defeated by their adversaries. Show me again, well, at the same time it was the same, but show me again the low estimate. I think it was there. No, it wasn't that, it was no. So that was the parallel. You see, Japan had ended up being reduced to its own territory at the end of the war. What would it be like for China? Presumably that it too would be dismantled. For the same reasons and according to the same principles as I've just indicated for Russia, depriving it in particular of all the territories where the Han are not in the majority, i.e. Tibet and Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are essentially present, so it's not impossible that it could be even more divided up than that, but at the very least I think the division would be like this. So this is the world we can imagine after this war. A China cut up like this into large parts. Mongolia extended to deprive it of a territory in the north, free Tibet. India regaining its borders enriched by Kashmir, the whole of Kashmir, and this pan-Turkish empire. I refer you to the program that justifies its form. Let's say it goes all the way to Xinjiang and takes over the whole Turkish space, which today is either more or less vassalized to Russia or more or less vassalized to China. Russia is functioning as a federation currently, and is composed of several constituent parts, including the major republics of Krasnoyarsk and Republic of Sakha. These names represent the diverse regions within the Russian Federation. With the anticipation of significant strategic changes, I confidently predict that the overall direction of geopolitical development will align with this prospect, ensuring an alignment of approximately 628 characters in the reformulated text. No matter how we get there, i.e. whether it's really a hot war or whether it's still a cold war, in a potential Cold War scenario, the expansion of the pan-Turkish Empire will not be achieved through territorial invasions. Instead, it will evolve by undermining the powers and local regimes. For instance, consider a situation where Putin's regime collapses without any invasion of Russian territories. In such a case, the Americans and NATO can support separatist movements financially and ideologically, leading to the desired dismantling outcome without resorting to military force. Turkey, on the other hand, stands to gain in the long run by exploiting the weakening positions of China and Russia, using diplomatic means and well-established strategies to solidify its influence over the heart of Eurasia. So here you have the map of what it will look like in the end, i.e. America and its military allies, Russia, which will be a military ally of the United States, just as defeated Germany was, and the same goes for China, just as defeated Japan was. So that's what the American empire will look like, i.e. America and its military allies at the end of this great geostrategic confrontation that we can foresee for, once again, the next 10 years. Yes, the next 10 years, I repeat. I think it will start before the end of the year, and given that the first elements I've been mentioning for a few years have already taken place, the annexation of Belarus, Russia's deployment in Libya, the confrontation between India and China, I think we're already in it, and that the timing will be respected.